Today's edition of Back Roads of Illinois. We are bringing you lasted for farming sources and information sponsored by AgriGold. I am Cesar Delgado. I am your host of today's program. We are glad you're here on today. We were talking about the crop technology with Tom Bachmann from Perrier Magazine for Farm Progress. We'll see what's new with technology on agronomy with Tom Bachmann from Perrier Magazine for Farm Progress. Then we were talking about the commodities markets with Joe Camp for Comstock. We were watching the tariffs for Canada and Mexico. Yag tariffs wars in Colombia over the weekend about the immigration issue. We will be talk about that with Joe. Otherwise, this is your rural news sponsored by AgriGold. This corresponds to the Farm Bill for this year. The American Farm Bureau, our top issue, is the Farm Bill for this Congress in Washington, D.C. This Farm Bill is due to the bipartisan challenges in Washington. This winter is very concerning about the soil in the Midwest, especially in central Illinois, probably because there is drought concerns in Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota. This was a mild winter in the Midwest. The National Cattle and Beef Convention will be held in San Antonio, Texas. There are many equipments for livestock and educational events in the convention in San Antonio. This has been your rural news for this afternoon. This is your commodities markets for this afternoon, sponsored by Kyle Bumstead. He's your commodity broker from Allendale Incorporated. Well, that the grains markets are up for today. Corn futures is up at 5 to 10 cents. Soybean futures is up at 3 to 6 cents. Chicago wheat is up at 4 to 6 cents. Let's take a look for the livestock markets. Cattle is up at 4 to 5 cents. Feeder cattle is up at 9 to 6 cents. Lean hogs is up at 4 to 6. This been your commodity markets for this afternoon. We were talking about the crop technology with Tom Bachmann from Perrier Magazine for Farm Progress. Hey, Tom, how are you today? Let's
I'm just
talk
fine.
about the harvest season in the Eastern Corn Belt. Could you tell us about that?
Uh, yes, it was on the dry side over here, so the harvest went out pretty early because it was also the growing degree days ran ahead all year last year. So soybeans were actually got really too dry, but a lot of the corn went out without having to be dried, and yield was uh, not quite as good as 2023, but depending on where you were, was still pretty good. In Indiana, tar spot hit a lot harder than in Illinois, and guys that didn't spray that decided they didn't want to invest anymore in the crop, especially in central and south central Indiana. A lot of them really got hit hard, up to 30, 40 bushel yield loss due to tar spot.
How was the growing days in Indiana? Tom.
They ran growing degree days ran ahead of schedule about all year, except for July was a little just slightly cooler than normal, and I think that really helped pollination. So I mean, we had some 250 to 270 bushel corn. Uh, Guys that either weren't in a real bad tar spot area or that sprayed. But the growing degree days then came back in August, September. Um, so that's what happened.
Great to hear that. How was the yield with corn and beans in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio?
As the best I know, we'll start. I've already kind of said for Indiana, corn was above average, not quite as good as what the USDA expected. I think that's why I was not surprised when they dropped the final numbers because tar spot itself hit a pretty big area in Indiana. In Ohio, they got on the dry side by mid-July, and southeastern Ohio went extremely dry, drought. That's not their bigger crop area, though. But even in west central Ohio, it was drier than normal and knocked back soybean yields, especially. In Illinois, I think they had less problems with tar spot in general. I still think maybe corn wasn't quite up to what they might have thought at one time there in July, but overall, I think yields were pretty decent in most places. Can you repeat that one for me?
How about bugs damages for Indiana?
If you're talking about insects and stuff, that kind of a surprising one last year was the corn aphid. It's usually not a problem in conventional commercial corn. It can be a problem in seed corn in the inbreds that have more trouble pollinating anyway. They're ready to spray for it. But in commercial corn, they took off, and some of the entomologists said they'd go away. And in some places it did, but in some places they persisted long enough that it did cause some yield loss. Some of the retailers, and especially in north central Indiana and in Illinois, thought that there were some places that were the aphids hurt. So whether they'll be back or not remains to be seen on the weather conditions this next year, and it'll be something they'll at least be aware of.
How about the corn leatherworm?
Repeat that one for me, Caesar.
How about the corn leatherworm?
I think what you're asking about corn rootworm and stuff. I know the Illinois entomologist Nick Sider has talked about a pretty mild year for rootworms, and there are very low numbers in most of Illinois. There are places, especially in very far northern Illinois, where there's a lot of continuous corn, and they've developed resistance to the traits. And there are issues, but other than if you're in an area where you have issues, you definitely need to pay attention to it. In most of the rest of Illinois and Indiana, it's been kind of low time for rootworms, and they don't seem to be causing a lot of problems. There are in Illinois, you can get either the northern corn rootworm or the western. So, especially in the northern part of the state, it's something to still pay attention to.
Is there anything else that would you like to talk to our audience on spring planting season like this year?
Well, another thing I can say, there's for it again, it's a time to get those planters checked out, and there's some farm shows coming up. Big one at Louisville. There's some others that'll have some of the newer technology. It might be a time. Make sure your equipment's ready to go. Quite a bit of interest in some of the new sprayer systems that can do target spraying. John Deere See and Spray, but there are others. Precision Planting's bringing out their Vision Symphony Vision systems this year on limited basis, and they're using cameras and AI and mechanical learning to machine learning to spray. They can spray green on green and select the weeds, and there's more people starting to look at that. It's kind of starting to get noticed, but I think you'll be hearing quite a bit about that this year and seeing some of those in the field now.
Do you have any final thoughts on the hybrid for this year?
No, I think you just need to, look at your past results, see what your seedsmen are saying. I had a chance to visit the seed testing lab uh, here recently and doing cold tests. And really, the companies do a good job of testing out and putting the lots of seed where they belong. And I think you can probably better spend your time making sure every row of the planter is planting at the right depth than maybe worrying about whether like doing cold tests on seed. There are labs that do it. There's a couple in South Dakota, but I think maybe putting your time into other areas might be more beneficial.
Thanks, Tom. I enjoyed our conversation for today.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me, and hope everybody stays warm.
This is Tom Bachmann from Perrier Magazine for Farm Progress on Back Roads of Illinois. We were talking about what's impact on the corn markets for tariffs for right now. Otherwise, we were talking about that with Joe Kemp. He is a commodity broker from Comstock.
Tariffs, yeah, wow. Uh, Big question. And we had a taste of that talk again over this last weekend. The latest was regarding Colombia, which came as a bit of a surprise, but it makes sense as they're linked closely to these changes in immigration policy. There was a back and forth over Saturday and Sunday. It seemed like the threat of some tariffs being charged against the U.S., which would proportionally have a greater impact potentially on the corn market. U.S. and Colombia are really close trading partners for agricultural exports, and the corn number one, and that includes Colombia. Of recent years being as much as a top five buyer of U.S. corn, and this year having stacked up some big commitment totals as well. So that's just a preview, though, of what could still be ahead. I know President Trump has mentioned February 1st is the next deadline for what can be new tariff announcements that could include China, Canada, Mexico, but more and more talk about there being maybe a broad-based universal type tariff on all goods coming into the country. And so when you think about ag exports, tariffs don't necessarily apply when you have U.S. tariffs levied on goods coming from other countries. But what we learned from the first time around with President Trump was that where you come into a potentially negative ramification for ag markets is if these countries that we tariff put retaliatory tariffs back on our goods, and that was the case with China and also Canada, Mexico, other countries, whether it's steel tariffs, those were in the news again today. Just a lot of moving parts, and it sets us up for another big weekend on political developments and a wait and see type approach. But of course, more of this week to go before then, and it's already been a lot of action down to start and then up here on Tuesday for grain futures.
There's the import numbers to that country. Joe,
I'm sorry, what was the question about imports?
what is the import numbers to that country? Joe.
You've got a ton of important data on exports that could change in a hurry. And I actually wrote the Comstock report about this Friday, an export update, just generally talking about where we are in terms of the sales pace for corn, soybeans, and wheat. And it's a big deal to, one, factor out Colombia, but of course also China as well. Even with the Chinese demand weakened compared to what we've been used to, they still account for over half of the soybean sales that we have on the books today. Uh, in general, both corn and soybeans, though, the sales pace since the beginning of the year, they're both running well ahead of where we need to be to meet the USDA targets. And so that's one point, I'm looking for in future USDA updates would be the higher usage on exports potentially being another source of cut to the carryout figures. So it's something to watch out for sure, especially when you talk about these big buyers of our ag products. We mentioned Colombia, U.S., Mexico, Canada, but also Japan, and a whole host of others.
Well, we will see that for next few weeks. Joe, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. That's something that won't go away anytime soon. This uncertainty or eventual reaction to changes in trade policy and everything else that's politically related.
What is the technical aspects on soybean futures? Could you tell us?
Sure. Soybeans have an interesting look. They've been in an uptrend. It still has to be called largely corrective in nature, given that we've been under this long standing downtrend from the 2022 highs. We did make a first stab higher at breaking that trend recently by getting above the September highs. And now, there's just a few spots up above the market that would form some
Markets. What going on with the feeder cattle?
Yeah, wow. It seems like only going up, although we did have taste of a potential turnaround yesterday, the sharply higher start that eventually turned around to a lower close for those feeders that you ask about. The feeders the leader? I mean, they had been up to this point really skyrocketing. We're in a bit of a different scenario this week, and we've been looking ahead to this week for the reason that Thursday is going to be the 30th for cash settlement for January feeder cattle futures. And so if you look at where the January board closed, just under 282, that has all, or maybe now more than caught up with the real-time feeder index that we're tracking. And so this issue of convergence that futures do as they approach expiration or delivery, which we should talk about for February live cattle, well, that could take some steam out of the market. But up to this point, and it's still the case now for February live cattle futures, that the cash trade has been just so far above and away stronger than the board. And so why sell the board even at record levels? Why, for these speculators that are now record net long across the cattle complex, what's the reason to take profit or to head for the exit if you don't see that there's any crack in the cash, at least for now? And the strong cash, continues to be just a simple reflection of the short-fed cattle supply, but also I'd say really resilient demand. We've got other issues like for feeder cattle, those Mexican imports still shut off. No real development on that, even after we thought that the border would be reopened at the first of the year. You have a lot of moving parts here, but it's all mostly bullish. We'll see if we get to a point, though, where, again, the January feeders are expired. The February contract, if they can catch up to the cash and get into the delivery period now coming up on February 10th, it could then look like a much different market. But for now, record all-time highs, record strength all around.
Do you have any concerns about these prices in the feeder side, Joe?
I do, yeah, from the sense that we think about profitability and the way that the feeders have stretched to such a historic gain over the live cattle, then that's hard to pencil out for producers. And there's another aspect of it, and that's packer margins, where we won't necessarily cry for the packers, but at the same time, it's something to watch for ahead if we get these margins so far in the red that eventually those cattle buyers have to slow things down, and do beef plants eventually start to shut down or slow down, for one, to respond to these prices that are less than profitable at the moment, or is there going to be an impact on immigration policy and the changes that could affect beef plant workers down the road as well? So those are potential cracks in the market, but again, that downturn or that give up we haven't observed yet.
Do you have any final thoughts on the corn markets for right now?
Yeah, I mean, whether it's corn or soybeans, wheat, cattle, I think all the same here. It's nice we could talk like we just have about the fundamentals, about demand, certainly exports, and the political influence is a little bit different. You think about weather in South America and the impact there. Talked about just generally short supplies and what we observed, like on the cattle on feed report last week. Placements down just over 3%. They're down for a fourth straight December. Almost on absolute levels, a 10-year low. These are the fundamental aspects, and it's still fundamental, but at the same time, it's almost unknown what the reaction is going to be in outside financial markets and the potential spillover support or pressure that we could get starting tomorrow afternoon, as soon as, given that we're going to react to the next Federal Reserve meeting. And so that's what I'd bring up, is just to preview what's ahead the rest of this week will be a response to what the central bank does with interest rates. They're not likely to cut rates this month, but they will provide guidance on policy ahead. And what that does to certainly the stock market and interest rates themselves and the metals. Crude oil is important, but definitely for the dollar index, which up until these last couple of days was showing some signs that it was leveling off and maybe starting to turn a broader top. And that's really crucial when you get back to the export potential for one, but also just generally the investment sentiment across the commodity space. Is that, again, something that provides a tailwind for us to continue higher in these markets after halfway through this week, or will it be a turnaround point because of overall risk off, sell everything type of worry? We'll see, again, starting tomorrow afternoon.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, thank you. Always happy to join you. I like what you're doing out there, so appreciate being included.
This is Joe Camp for Comstock on Back Roads of Illinois. Thanks to Tom Bachmann and Joe Camp for Comstock. This has been Back Roads of Illinois. I am Cesar Delgado. You have a great day.